The Supreme Court is taking up the issue of Biden's student debt relief program. Two cases are at the Supreme Court. They heard arguments yesterday. One of them in particular they focused on, that is Biden versus Nebraska. There are about 6 states that have come together to sue the Biden administration, saying that the student debt relief program that he announced is unconstitutional, that essentially it cannot be done. It is harming the states. If you remember, Biden announced the debt relief program, which would forgive up to $20,000 in loans for qualifying borrowers last August. A lot of people are very against that. A lot of people are very for that. Here to help us break this down is Sabrinasalvati. She's an activist, educator, host of Sabs podcast, and co-host of Revolutionary Blackout Network. Sabby, it's so great to have you on the show.
Hi, Kim. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so where do you stand with the student debt relief program? Let's just start there.
So I am a little biased. I do have student debt. Yes, I still have it. I also worked as an academic advisor for a little over 10 years in higher education. And I've seen students just graduate with tremendous amounts of student loan debt. And I'm talking like $70,000, $80,000. It's gotten to that point. So I was for student loan debt cancellation, but I wanted it to be done the right way. And Joe Biden did not do this the correct way. So in February of 2021, there was actually an initiative put forth by Ayanna Pressley, Chuck Schumer, and Elizabeth Warren to cancel student loan debt. And they laid out specific instructions of how to do it. And one of those instructions was to do it through the Higher Education Act of 1965. Joe Biden did not take that route. He decided instead to do this through the HEROES Act. Now, why is that problematic? Because once he declared that the pandemic was no longer an emergency state, we were no longer under that in the United States, that throws away the HEROES Act because that's what that was for. That's why that was in place. So when this was announced, there's a couple of us, myself and Brianna Joy Gray as well, we were trying to warn people that this is going to get shut down because you're not under the HEROES Act anymore. We're not under a state of emergency. And that's exactly what happened. But if Joe Biden had actually followed instructions, we probably wouldn't be in this situation. But I think that this really shows people the power that the Supreme Court has. And I think that people really need to pay attention to this particular situation because it could apply to other progressive policies as well. And I'll bring up the one with Medicare for All. A lot of people don't realize that even if we had Medicare for All implemented, the Supreme Court could also shut that down. So I think this is a wake-up call for a lot of people. I feel really bad for the Gen Z generation because they heavily came out to support Democrats during the midterms. Part of the reason was for student debt cancellation, and the other reason was to codify Roe v. Wade, which that didn't happen either. So I feel like this was basically a ploy to encourage voter turnout in the midterms, because after the midterm results were revealed that same week, this was struck down by a federal judge.
You know, what's interesting, I hear you, I totally understand. But what's interesting about this case in particular, these two cases, I suppose, and of course, SCOTUS mostly focused on Biden versus Nebraska. It is possible that actually the justices go in the favor of the Biden administration because this was done under the HEROES Act, actually. Because this was done under the guise of the national emergency. What they're trying to argue and what the justices are actually kind of saying, okay, maybe there's a point there, is that what they're trying to say is that because of the emergency, there are certain powers that are granted to these various departments in these times of emergencies. And even though the HEROES Act, even though the emergency ends, even though the HEROES Act would technically end, I think May 3rd is the day that the Biden administration says the emergency is over. The forcing these students to now go back to paying these student loans that have been on hold since 2020 would put them in a worse position financially because of the national emergency. And because they're able to couch it with the national emergency, and that is key, and that seems to be the key. That's the key thing that the justices are focusing in on, is that certain powers are granted only in times of emergency, and not to cancel student debt, but to waive or modify loans. and that this would be one of those things. This would be waiving or modifying those loans because it would end up putting these people in a bad position because of the emergency. So it's possible, though, that this ended up being the way to go, right? Because if they do rule in that way, if they say, well, you know, an emergency is an emergency and you are allowed to do these certain things, Congress was clear about that in the way they crafted these emergency sort of provisions, you know, that's possible. It is possible that it happens because of that, but it would never happen again. So that would be something, this would be a one-time thing, only for certain borrowers, only under certain circumstances, only because of the emergency. This would not actually overhaul or change or do anything to the current system that we're in, which is students going into enormous amounts of debt. And older generations don't totally understand that if they don't have a kid in college now, they think, or, you know, people that are in their 40s or 50s now even, who don't have quite college age kids yet, may say, well, I paid for my debt, I'm fine, right?
Yeah.
Not realizing that the young kids are going into massive amounts of debt because of the cost of college being outrageous. I mean, it is outrageous. These kids are graduating with, I mean, in my era, it was on average, you'd graduate with 30 grand of student debt. That was a lot, but now I think it's even double that.
Yes, it's there's no accountability put on the universities here for continuing to increase tuition over the years. It's ridiculous. Even the state schools are expensive now. And we also have to look at like our parents' generation, because there are some of the jobs that were available during that time that actually did not require a college degree. They were
Yeah.
trained on the job, and now those jobs require a college degree. So a lot of kids, they have no choice basically but to go to college if they want to make a decent living, which we can argue about what a decent living is today, because we don't have a livable wage guaranteed
Right.
to American people. And so you have students graduating from college with like $70,000 of student loan debt, and they're
Yeah.
not making a salary that's $70,000 a year. So these kids are going to be paying on these loans till they're like in their 50s, and they can't buy a house. Some of these kids can't get married. They can't afford it. They're just like, we don't have the money. They can't start families, Kim. Like,
Right.
how is this even, how is this still a thing? And so I know other people can make the argument as well about medical debt. I would say the same thing about medical debt is preventing people from doing these things. But these kids have no path to generational wealth.
Right.
It stops here. If you can't afford a home ownership, if you can't afford to even like start a family, like where does this end? And it speaks to a bigger issue that we have in this country, is that there isn't a guaranteed living wage. We watched 7 Democrats vote down the $15 minimum wage increase. So people are still
Yeah.
making $7.25 an hour in this country. So it's a big problem. But I think there needs to be some pushback on the universities about increasing the cost of tuition, because it seems like there's no limit, and they're continuing to do this, and these kids are just continuing to go in tremendous amounts of debt. It's sad.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna share with you my plan. I think you're really smart, so you could help. You know, you could dissect it and tell me if you think this is a good plan or not. I've always thought that, for one, I do think that the burden of student debt does need to be lifted on people in order to allow the middle class to flourish. As you mentioned, people with a lot of student debt are not able to really fully engage in the same way previous generations have been able to and build up this country's middle class, which would be the backbone of the nation. They're not able to do that. Even doctors and lawyers, people think, oh, but you're a doctor or a lawyer, you went to grad school, you'll be just fine. They're riddled in enormous amounts of debt that even keep them from home ownership, and they're doctors and lawyers. So this is not helping, you know, the people who are ultimately going to be rich. But for one, the student debt program, the student loan forgiveness doesn't even go for them anyway. These are for undergrads with lower amounts of income and and the debt relief is small, you know, 20 grand or something. It's not like 200 grand. But I've always thought, you know, you have to stop the cycle, right? The cycle is these universities just running amok with the tuition prices. They just every year after year after year raise these prices. Even state schools, they're going crazy. So I've always thought that the reason why we have to get to the root of why are they raising tuition costs. It's not like they're building a bunch of state-of-the-art buildings. It's not like books cost a lot more than they did back in the day. It's not like knowledge has become expensive. So why are they doing this? And I think it's because the banks, it's a double-edged sword, but I think the banks continue to give out student loans. And those student loans, then the universities say, well, we could charge whatever we want because the banks will give the loans. And the loans are federally backed. So the government is willing to guarantee these loans. So the bank says, well, then I have no reason not to give the loan. And then the bank gives out the loan, and the university says, well, I have no reason not to raise up tuition sky high because I know the bank's going to give me the loan, and the bank says, and I know I'm going to get the money from the government if the student defaults. So it's this vicious cycle. Now, we need student loans because a lot of people cannot afford the price of tuition. That's how people go from lower class, middle class, and raise up, is by getting those educations and by getting out of it. That's why the GI Bill was so amazing for so many of those returning World War II soldiers, because they got the opportunity for education, which then built the middle class in this country, right? So we have to go after the banks. Really, more than anything, the federal government needs to somehow put a limit on the amount of money the banks are allowed to lend to the students.
Yep.
And what that would do, in my opinion, is it would force the universities to lower the cost of tuition. Otherwise, they'd lose students, because a lot of lower income students would say, even with those loans, if I'm capped, I can't afford that school. So they wouldn't go. And the universities need students. That's how they make money too. That's how they stay around. So if we cut the cord, we've got to cut the cord and say you're only allowed, the federal government is only going to back a certain amount and only at certain interest rates. You go above, you go beyond that, we're not backing it. Then the banks would say, oh, then I don't want to give out that loan. And then the university would say, well, then shoot, I don't get the student. So they would have to reverse. They would have to reverse course. They would have to lower tuition. They would have to reduce these loans. I mean, I think that's the only way. And then on top of that, you have to relieve the pressure on middle class society and relieve like 20 grand of these loans. That's kind of my plan. I don't know why, but maybe it's a terrible plan. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a great idea. I think that you made the connection perfectly. The banks, the universities, and these student loan companies are all connected, and so is Congress. I remember I heard a representative from Sallie Mae say one time to my student group, by the way, that they're not worried about going away because they have a representative in DC that sits on the Hill to make sure that companies like them stay in place.
Right.
All of these organizations, all these people are connected. And so I used to give students this advice because I advise grad students. If they would come to me and ask me to get more education, if they should get a PhD, and these were science students, I told them, just go get a job in industry.
Right.
Do not go on to get the PhD. You're going to be poor and struggling for the next 5 to 7 years. That's how long it takes. And some of them had families at that point as well. Don't do it. Just go get a job in industry. You're going to make more money that way. And when you get your PhD, you become a postdoc, usually first anyway, and then you go into the tenure track. Hopefully you go into the tenure track. I said, just don't do it. And
Right.
I tell students today, if I were you, if I could do it all over again, I would go to school in a country where the college is free. Go to school in Germany if you can afford
Right.
to do it. Like, don't go under all of this enormous amount of student loan debt. If you can't do that, go to trade school or go to a community college, at least for the first 2 years, and then you can
Yeah.
transfer to university. That'll cut down some of the debt as well. But if I could do it all over again, I definitely would have done things differently because I did get a lot of debt from student loans. And then when you look at the salaries, it does not make sense. So that's my request, a recommendation to anyone watching that is thinking about whether or not they want to go to a university. Like, if you can go to school abroad in a country where college is free, I highly recommend that.
Yeah, and the idea of community college. I did that. I went to community college for a couple of years. That helped save some bills. Ultimately, though, I still went to a state school and walked out with $35,000 in student debt from 2 years at a state university, because that's how, University of California, Davis, that's what it was. But people aren't realizing, that is enormous, an enormous burden. That then what happens? It's this cycle. These young people get out of college. They go to a job. When you're young, jobs come and go. You're going into jobs, you're leaving jobs, you get laid off from jobs, and so there's these periods of time you have to do loan forbearance or deferment, right? And then the interest continues on to the loans a lot of those times. And so you just kind of never get out from under these loans until you're in your 40s and you're finally able to get a more stable career and start paying off more of the principal every month or something. I mean, it's a really negative cycle. Another thing too that I think should be done, there's a lot of people out there watching that don't want to forgive any of the student debt. They just feel like, look, you marched yourself into that. That's your fault. I don't agree with that because I do think society, there is, whether people like it or not, there is a clear and direct correlation between the amount of education you have and the amount of income you're going to make. It's not all. There's certainly exceptions to the rule, but by and large, if you take a group of 20 students and you give them all a college education, they're going to make more money in their lifetime than the group of 20 students who did not. There might be one outlier that goes and starts a business and makes $1 million, but that is an outlier, not the rule, right? So there is an encouragement from a national security perspective to want to get an educated population. You want to be able to compete against these other nations and their industry. You don't want to end up owned by China, right? You want to be able to compete against China if that's the sentiment you've got. But the interest alone, if you don't want to forgive it, if you're still in that mindset, there should at least be the idea that a student loan shouldn't cost you interest. That should be completely abolished. There should be no interest on students getting educations. Same thing with medical debt. There should be no interest on, you shouldn't have medical debt, but if you're going to have medical debt, because nobody knows when, shit's going to happen and you're going to end up in the hospital, you're going to have cancer, something's going to happen. You shouldn't have medical debt. But if you do, there should be no interest on it, which I think for the most part, a lot of times you're just owed, you just owe the hospital or owe the place, and maybe they don't put that on you. But student debt with interest, that doesn't make sense. This country's trying to make money. Banks are trying to make money off of young people just trying to better their lives. That's crazy. But here we are.
And if you default on these loans, your credit is ruined. It is destroyed. Yeah. And I know people that have fallen into that situation. I know people that have paid over $30,000, $40,000 towards their student loans, and they still owe the same amount because all that money has gone to the interest. So they haven't even paid the balance down yet. And this is the problem that a lot of people are running into. It's a sad state of affairs. We haven't been paying these student loans for since 2020 now. That just goes to show you they can cancel it. They can just cancel all of it. And I think, go ahead,
yeah,
Kim.
and that's in the SCOTUS hearings. What's interesting is that the justices are all kind of questioning whether or not this case even has merit with Biden versus Nebraska. Because they're saying, does this have any standing? Can this case even be brought forward in front of the court? That's one of the first things they're going to be determining. Because they said, where was the harm? Who was harmed? They looked at the states, the 6 states that are filing this, and they said, which one of you were harmed? And the Nebraska Attorney General says, well, Missouri was harmed, actually, because they've got this program it's called MOHELA. It's the Missouri... they have this loan program. I'm trying to see, Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority. And they're saying that this would cut MOHELA's funding by nearly 40%. And because of that, then there would be less financial aid in Missouri because there'd be less revenue to this MOHELA. But then the court was saying, yeah, but that's a private institution. That's not Missouri. And if they want to sue, then they should sue. We don't even know. So they're the ones that would need to bring the lawsuit forward because they're the ones who would be harmed. But the states themselves, they were unable to show that they were harmed by student debt cancellation. So think about that, people. I mean, now if you're just against it, it's just because you're against it for whatever, a feeling of unfairness. It's not because you will be harmed if somebody else doesn't have debt suddenly. It's just a feeling of unfairness that people are upset about. It doesn't actually
I think so
harm
too.
them.
And it also... Right. And if they canceled it, that also puts more money back into the economy. I mean, a lot of young people that I know, they're leaning more towards a minimal lifestyle. So they're not These kids aren't trying to live a lavish lifestyle. A lot of these kids have 4 roommates living here in Boston, paying expensive rent. They're just trying to get by. They just want to have a decent standard of living, just like a lot of their parents may have had. And you can't even attempt it, it seems like, in this country because of everything going on. There's also the issue with the inflation. Everything's higher now. Everything costs more. Some of the landlords that said that they would not increase rents are still increasing the rent during this time as well. So I think as long as these kids have like this debt hanging over their heads, I don't see a path forward. Some may get lucky, but I don't see a path forward for most of them for establishing some type of generational wealth. And that
Yeah.
is going to be a problem later on down the road in reference to the economy. And I think people are just going to have to see that for themselves.
I think when you use the word wealth, though, it throws people off. I would almost change that and never use that. I would say middle class. We're trying to build up the middle class. It's national security. Because the people, certain people will already agree with us that there's certain student, that student loans need to be drastically reduced or forgiven, or something's got to happen to get this burden off. But there's a lot of people who are super against it. So I always try to figure out a way to speak their language, right? Get across to that group that is really. So I think if you use the word wealth, they're like, yeah, well, you shouldn't be, you got this loan to go and become wealthy. And that's not fair. And that doesn't sound fair. It's not like these kids went off and bought Ferraris and now they're like, oh, forgive my Ferrari debt. It's, actually your Ferrari debt, you could go bankrupt, but you can't go bankrupt with student loans. They don't let you.
No, and that's also because of Joe Biden. He was the one who implemented that piece of legislation that you can't file for bankruptcy for student loans.
Good old Joe, right? Well, I don't know, man. I don't know. But I have this argument till I'm blue in the face because I know a lot of people watching this right now are totally against student debt cancellation. So I have this argument a lot until I'm blue in the face because I do think it's a matter of national security, building the middle class. There's just a lot. There's a lot that I could make arguments for all day, but we have to go now. So we can't continue on, Sabby. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Kim.